Hi there, thank you so much for joining me today. This video is a swatch party or an inventory of all of the greens that I have in my collection. I have them separated into different types of greens, and that way we can go through them in a more organized fashion. If there's any light changes, just know that the clouds are moving around a lot, and I tried to wait to see if they would stop doing that, but they're just not going to. I will have actual swatches to compare all of the shades, and so you will get more accurate swatches throughout the video. I won't be doing them live. I saw Chic Geek do this video a couple weeks ago. She did it with all of the duochromes and multichromes in her collection, and I just really like how she did that. It was a fun way to kind of take a peek into someone else's eyeshadow collection, especially someone who maybe has different or more eyeshadows than you, and then they kind of compare them side to side. It kind of gives you a better idea of like what they look like in comparison with other shades, especially if you own some of those shades too. And I do have a video I did years ago where I actually swatched all of my eyeshadows by color family. So all of my yellows, all my reds, all my oranges, blues. I went through the entire rainbow, and a lot of those eyeshadows I don't have anymore, so it's not like the most accurate, but I still think it's fun to watch. So I'll have Chic Geek's video and my original swatch video in the description box. But without further ado, let's just get started. The first category I want to talk about, I have two shades, and they're my could be greener shades. They're technically in the green family, so I'm including them in this video, but for one reason or another, they kind of miss the mark for me. And the first one I have is Easy Peasy from the Limoncello palette, and that is the one that's at the bottom. It's number 1. So this is not a purely green shadow. It's definitely a duochrome. It has a warm reddish brown base and then a greeny gold shift. And for me, at least the way it shows up on my lids, it definitely pulls a lot more gold than green. And then the one above it is from the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette, and it is in the shade Deanna. And in the pan, it looks like it's gonna be a really rich, deep olive, but definitely on the eyes it does not translate like that. In the swatch I think it looks, you know, slightly green. It definitely looks like a more olive shade, but on the lids it just does not look like that, at least on me. So those are the two what I would consider to be dud greens in my collection. Now let's move over into shades that have a real green shift. They're either a duochrome or a multichrome, and two of them are from the Pilbara palette from Geologie Cosmetics. The first one, number 1 in that photo, is Starry Sky, and this one has a white base but a green shift, and this is beautiful. If you're going for a green look and you want just something to take it up a notch, putting this in the inner corner or tapped all over the lid is the way to go. Beautiful. It is chunky, but that's kind of what you would expect from that type of shade. And then the other shade from this palette involved in this photo is number 3, which is the last one, and it's the one next to it called Spinifex. Spinifex is a duochrome, so it has a browny reddish base and then a green shift, and that green is much more apparent than Easy Peasy that I talked about. Beautiful. These pair nicely together, and this also just really can punch up any like olive green look that you're trying to create. And I will say Spinifex is much smoother. It's a much smoother formula than Starry Sky. And that one in the middle is a multichrome. It is from Lethal Cosmetics, and it's the shade Retrograde. And that one it's a multichrome, so it has a lot of different shifts to it. But for me, with the types of shades that I pair it with, I definitely get a lot more of the green. So it has like a purple, it has greens in there, it has an orange, like it has so much going on. And then the green, especially whenever I put it over like a dark gray base, which is how I typically wear this, that is when the green comes out the most, and it's just stunning. So now we're going to be breaking into the more traditional green shades, ones that are just actual pure greens, and we're going to start with light to dark. So the first category is lights. It's mostly shimmers, but I do have a couple mattes to talk about. The two mattes are from the Shroud Creepy Cute palette, and one of them maybe you wouldn't consider to be a true green. It's kind of like a minty blue green, but I wanted to include it just for comparison purposes. So number 1, the more bluish one, is Creep It Real, and then the one next to it is Take a Hint, which is more of a traditional green. The reason I included Creep It Real is because I consider it to be right in the middle between Cold Shoulder, which I consider to be a blue, and then Creep It Real, which is a green. Like if you look at it between the two, it's not 100% blue. It's got a little bit of like a greenish tint to it. And then the next four are light green shimmer shades. And the first one, I don't think they make it anymore. I was trying to find it online and I couldn't find it. So this is Emerald from Clionadh Cosmetics. And this one is what I have on my lid today with a couple of other shades. And this is really pretty because it's a light green, but it's still warm. Some of the other greens I'm going to talk about, they're light and they're a little bit more like silvery. This one has like a little bit of like a goldish yellow green. The next one is a super metallic one from the It's Freakin' Bats palette from Shroud. And this one is beautiful. This is probably like the most neutral light green shimmer that I have. And I just love it. It's so beautiful and it is light enough to use on the inner corner. Which technically so is Emerald, but I feel like this one has a little bit more of a lighter reflect that it looks better in the inner corner. The next green is from the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself palette, which is discontinued, and it's the shade Marvel. That is what I'm wearing on my inner corner today. And this is a really beautiful metallic light green, but it is a little bit more silvery. It's a little bit more cool tone and definitely very brightening. It's beautiful. And then the one up top is from the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette again, and it is called John. In the pan, it doesn't look that green, but it definitely is like a super light, slightly gold, like kind of like a antique gold maybe, not like a yellowy gold. And this is also a beautiful, brightening, very light green shade. So if you're doing a green look and it's kind of pulling too deep for you, or you want something to brighten it up, maybe put something like right in the center, like a spotlight, or just something on the inner corner, John here is a beautiful, beautiful shade to do that with. Before I go to the dark greens, I wanted to kind of make a little pit stop in the center and focus on olives, because that's the majority of the greens that I have are either shimmers or mattes with olive undertones. So we're going to start with the olive shimmer shades. So the first metallic olive shade I want to talk about is the brightest, the most yellowy green olive, and that is Handbook from the It's Freakin' Bats palette from Shroud. This one is super pigmented and it definitely is like the warmest olive shimmer that I have, and it's beautiful. And the one underneath it is back to the Limoncello palette from Colourpop. It is in the shade Capri, and this one is also a warmer green. It's just a little bit more toned down and not as bright and pigmented as Handbook. The next one is another super pigmented one. It's a little bit deeper than Handbook, and it's from the Juicy Olive palette from Give Me Glow Cosmetics. It is the shade Garnish here, which it's still got that like warm green. It has a little bit less yellowy gold to it, and it is deeper than Handbook. The next one is a single from Clionadh Cosmetics. It's a metallic shade in the shade Rune, and this one is what I would like, it's what I think when I think of the actual color of an olive just made into a shimmer shade. So it's a little bit deeper, a little bit more cool toned, and it is stunning. It's beautiful, but I do find that if I really want to take that green undertone up a notch, I do need to pair it with other greens. And then we're going back to the Juicy Olive palette for that other shimmer shade. It's in the shade Shaken Not Stirred, and there isn't like a huge difference between the undertones of those two shades, but Shaken Not Stirred is slightly more like grayish cool toned and a little bit deeper. Now for olive mattes, which I think is probably my favorite. Like, I mean, I love an olive shimmer, but whenever I reach for olives, I tend to really love playing up with different olive mattes and like putting them together to create looks. And I don't have any olive mattes in my eye look, which is surprising. The first one I want to talk about, number one, is from a Sydney Grace single, and it's in the shade Ivy League. And this one is probably, I guess you would consider it more of a khaki than an olive, but it's like a very, very cool toned light greenish gray. And I still wanted to include it, even if it just meant comparing it to the other more like greeny olive shades, true olives that I have in my collection. Beautiful shade, really great transition or starter, or if you are going for more of like a cool toned olive look, this is the way to go. For that more yellowy matte there for number two, we're going back to the Geologie Pilbara palette, and it is the shade Chalcopyrite. Because it's like on the olivey green side of the palette, I do think it pulls a lot more olive like in my head than it does in real life, but I do feel like it's still within that olive family. It's just a very, very yellow mustardy version of it. And then the third one is Trapa from the It's Freakin' Bats palette. This one is so beautiful. oh my goodness. I don't want to say it's like my favorite matte olive in my collection, because I do like all of them equally, just for slightly different reasons or for slightly different looks, but this is just so beautiful, so stunning and unique in my collection. You can tell I don't have anything else like it. It's just so stunning and so pigmented. You only need the littlest bit to get a really, really beautiful blown out look. And I have created looks with this shade before. It was in my most recent Shroud Cosmetics eyeshadow bingo palette, and I also did a 3 looks 1 palette video with this palette, and I did a look with that color and just really love how it looks. I think I put it like all over the lid in the crease. Like, I end up using a ton of this every time I reach for it. The next 2 shades are from the Give Me Glow Juicy Olive palette. Of course, I'm going to be featuring every shade from this palette because it's specifically an olive green palette. But the first one is Dry Martini, which is this corner shade here. And then the next one, number 5, is Vodkatini. These don't look too dissimilar, like in the pans and also on the eyes. Like, I don't know. I feel like if you're going to do a palette with 6 shades, I feel like all of the shades should be like very different enough. And that's very subjective. You might have this palette and love every shade. I don't know if it was necessary to have both of these. And if you can see in the side-by-side swatches, they're slightly different, but they're not that much different. The next one, number 6, is Dirty Martini, which is this bottom center shade. And that one is more of a cool toned, deeper shade. Beautiful, stunning. Number 7, we have Colourpop Team Captain. I purchased this a long time ago whenever I was trying to find a lot of olive shades. I had purchased, I think, a couple from NYX that were disappointing, and I just wasn't finding any that I felt like were really good. So then I ended up purchasing a ton of olives, and it's right around the time that I purchased the Juicy Olive palette because I was getting frustrated. Maybe it's harder to formulate an olive green than you think it might be, because I feel like it has a tendency to go more gray than anything, and then it doesn't translate as like a true olive on the lid. But Juicy Olive does not have that problem, and neither does Team Captain. I would say on my eyes it's probably more khaki than olive, but still beautiful nonetheless. Number 8, we're going back to the Pilbara palette, and the shade Pilbara Marble is that deepest olive matte there. And this one I like because even though it is a deeper deepening shade, I feel like it definitely stays olive and it doesn't tend to pull like that grayish color. And the very last one is the last shade I'm going to talk about from the Juicy Olive palette, and that is the shade Cocktails. I wanted to mention briefly, Dirty Martini is one of the darkening shades I have on my outer corner. I did mix it with Shroud Tombstone, which is like a really dark gray, just because I wanted to make it a little bit more cool toned. I don't know why. I love a warm toned look as well, but for some reason I wanted to put them together. And yeah, so this is what I have in conjunction with another shade on my outer corner. But Cocktails is the deepest one, and I do appreciate that even though it is a very, very dark shade and like getting closer to a black color, it still retains its green undertone. And the last set of greens I want to talk about are my dark greens. I'm going to start from the lightest dark to the darkest dark. And that first one is a Sydney Grace single in the shade Keep It Fun. This shade is definitely more of like a blue-green, kind of like a teal color. And this is a shade that, depending on what colors you pair it with, you can make it look more green or make it look more blue. That second one is another Clionadh single, and this is in the shade Morgana. And this one is a very, very beautiful, like true green color. If you're looking for like a Christmas green to wear or something, this is a great shade to reach for. That next color is from the Shroud Cosmetics Arcana palette, and it is in the shade Alchemy, and this is a stunning color. And I remember it was called the Prism palette from ABH. That one had a very similar color like that, but whenever I saw people panning it or swatching that, it didn't seem like it had as much like of a greeny reflect. Like I think it pulled more of like the dark gray undertone that it had instead of like a true green. This one, it retains its color, and so even though it is a darker color, it does still have that pop. And it's definitely like the darkest shimmery green that I have. And I know I already talked about Cocktails from the Give Me Glow palette in my olive mattes portion of the video, but I also wanted to include it in here because it is also a very dark green, and it's one of my darkest mattes that I have. And then the very last one is back to the Arcana palette from Shroud, and it is the shade Darkling. This is definitely like a cooler tone dark green, and I think comparing it to Cocktails is really good because then it really shows that Cocktails is, I would say Cocktails is deeper and it still keeps that olive undertone even though it is quite deep and cool toned. Darkling I think is more of like a forest green. So those are all of the green eyeshadows I have in my collection. I hope you enjoyed watching it and it was kind of fun to see them grouped into different undertones or different levels of depth. Greens are one of my favorite eyeshadows that I have, so I did have quite a few to share, but I could definitely do this with other colors in my collection. If you'd like to see me do like mauves or blues or purples, maybe I could do colors that are relevant to the season that I'm in, so I could focus on like more autumnal shades this time around, and then once we hit winter I could focus on more wintry tones and so forth. Let me know what you'd like to see. If you liked it the way that I sorted it out, the way I had it organized, or if there's like a better way that I could be doing that. This is also really useful for me personally, like if I'm out shopping or if I'm thinking of something that I want to buy online, I can kind of already have an inventory of what I already have, and that way maybe I don't buy a bunch of repeat shades, or I can find what types of shades that I'm missing. Please tell me which one was your favorite green color. Do you prefer light greens, olives, darks? Do you like getting really vampy with it? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But in the meantime, that's everything I have. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in my next video.